Hello, I'm Nathan, the creator of HEXMAP, a strategic map building game. I'd like to give you a summary of the rules so that you know how it's played and what the game's about. HEXMAP is played with a deck or stack of 132 custom tiles, hexagonal tiles from which the map is built. You'll also need 2 six-sided dice and 36 tokens, 6 tokens each of 6 different colors. Between 2 and 6 people can play, and each player gets their own token color to start. The goal of play for each player is to move their tokens, one at a time, across the map, starting from a central origin tile, out through tiles along open paths, to an output or exit tile. Each time a token moves onto an output, it's exited, removed from the map, and it scores 1 point for its player. Players play until one player reaches a certain target score. The target score is agreed upon ahead of time by the players and is generally set based on the number of players and the length of game desired. So a higher target score makes for a longer game, and if there are more players, you may want to set a lower target score so that it doesn't run that much longer. Players are building the map, a tile at a time, on their turns, so the map grows and expands as they play and as their tokens move. A player almost always will get to map at least one tile as part of their turn. The other way that tiles are mapped is when a token moves off the edge of the map through an open side, more on that in a moment, to an empty unmapped space. When that happens, the player can end their turn by mapping another tile, placing it in that space. Tiles are always mapped face to face, side to side, in alignment, so that it maintains the hexagonal grid. And as I mentioned, tiles have open and closed sides. Open being the light uncolored side, closed being the dark side. Tokens can only move through an open side of a tile, whereas closed sides are blocked to movement. HEXMAP tiles have varying numbers of open versus closed sides. So the tiles with all sides open, all 6 sides, are called hex hubs. That includes the origin. Each type of hex hub has some type of unique rule attached that alters movement through that tile. More on that later. The tiles with all 6 sides closed are the outputs, which makes sense because when a tile reaches that, when a token reaches that tile, it exits the map, doesn't need to go anywhere else. Almost all other tiles have between 1 and 5 sides open. So a tile with 1 side open is referred to as a filter, since tokens can only exit in one direction. With 2 sides open, I've called a bridge. There are 2 ways to go. And with 3 sides, 4 sides, or 5 sides open, those are called branches, because there's a choice of paths to go out of that tile. The one other exception is the delete tile, which has no sides. That's because these special tiles don't get mapped to create a new map tile, but they're placed on existing map tiles to make them unmapped. More on that later as well. So on each player's turn, they're going to want to move their token across the tiles to an output if possible, or at least possibly to the edge of the map so they can map further out and eventually find an output. As I mentioned before, tokens can move only through an open side and not through a closed side. This is particularly important at the beginning of each turn for a player. At the beginning of a turn, a player will roll one of the d6 for their direction roll. Now, I rolled a 4, which you'll note on this tile is closed. That token will not move that turn. It is considered halted, and the player will not get movement. However, if I had rolled a 5, which is open, that token can and must move on that turn. Now, if a player rolls an open direction, they then roll the other d6 for their movement roll. I rolled a 6. That means that the token can and must move 6 hexes, 6 tiles, on its turn, with some exceptions. If the token makes it to an output, it's exited. It needs no further movement, and the turn will end there. If the token moves off the edge of the map through an open side onto an unmapped tile, or unmapped hex, then it will map that hex, and it loses its remaining hexes of movement for the turn. It ends there. With some exceptions, if there's a movement effect from a hex hub. And that's the third exception to movement, is if a token lands on a hex hub, it may be stopped there entirely, or it might get additional hexes of movement, depending on the effect. So, otherwise, if it's moving through standard tiles on the map, you have to use every hex of that movement roll. Now, when moving, it's important to note that only whether the side is open or closed on your current tile matters about the directions you can move. It doesn't matter if the corresponding side of the destination hex is closed. In this case, it just makes it a one-way path. On the other hand, if both adjacent sides are open, you can move through one and then backtrack. Perfectly legal if you have additional hexes of movement available, and sometimes for strategic reasons, that may be a good plan. You may want to go into the hex you're required to go to by your direction roll, that first hex of movement, and then back out of it, or use up hexes of movement if there's a particular tile that you want to land on. That's all right. Now, between the direction roll and the movement roll is the mapping phase. That's when a player gets to map that one tile on every turn. The reason that they're placed in that order, direction, mapping, and then movement, is so that before they map a tile, the player knows if they're going to be moving or if they're halted, if they're moving, which direction, but they don't yet know how far their token is going to move. So this creates a decision to be made. If the direction is off the map, you know that's all the farther you're going to go, unless you put a tile there first, in which case you might get 2 spaces or more. So do you do that? Do you, whether you're halted or not, place a tile in such a way that it blocks an opponent, preventing them from moving or making it more difficult? Do you create branches for yourself further out in the map to give more options for movement later and keep opponents from blocking you? Or do you head straight for the edge of the map as quickly as possible, hoping to get to an output? Choices to be made. So that's an idea of how play proceeds within a given player's turn. Now I'd like to explain how the full game plays out, starting from the beginning with setup. Because the map is built tile by tile during play, setup is very easy. You just pull out the origin tile and place it in the center of the table or other play space. You'll need a relatively large play area, about 4 feet in diameter, so the map can build out as big as necessary to get to the outputs. Bigger is better, but just bear in mind that the map could expand in any direction to any potential distance. Once you've got that set up, shuffle the stack. All the rest of the tiles together. Because they're hexagonal tiles, it's usually easier to do multiple cuts rather than a bridge shuffle, but get them as random as you can. Once that's done, pick a dealer, who will then deal out to each player 1 tile. This is called their memory or memory tile. Now you deal those out face down, and of course the stack is face down as well. Each player can look at their own memory tile and see what they've got. The memory tile is an option during play, a choice to map that you already know. That way it gives a choice between the memory or something random. Once that's done, you want to decide on the target number for the game. How many tokens will a player need to exit to win? Again, a higher number will produce a longer game, a lower number a shorter game. Generally recommend between 3 and 5, but if it's 2 players, you might want to go for all 6. If there are 6 players, you might want to keep it down to just 3. Once that's decided, then you need to find out which player goes first. Easiest way is just to use the d6s. Each player rolls 1 and the highest number goes first, re-rolling for ties. But you can use any mutually agreed method. Each player then chooses a color, which color they're going to play for the game, and takes all the tokens of that color. Each player then places 1 token of their color on the origin. And that's it to get started. Play then proceeds by turns, starting with the first player and going clockwise to their left. Each player takes 1 turn, and 1 turn per player is a complete round. As I've mentioned, each player's turn has 3 phases: direction roll, mapping, and movement roll. I'd like to touch on each of those in a little more detail. So, at the start of a turn, a player rolls 1 die for their direction roll. If that direction is open, they proceed. If that direction is closed, the token is halted and cannot move. So they're going to skip their movement roll on that turn. Now, random die rolls can be unforgiving, and especially on tiles like filters with most sides closed, it can take a while before you roll an open direction. Players may want to choose one of a number of optional escape rules to reduce the time that tokens spend halted and not moving. I'll discuss those escape rules in more detail later, but rolling a closed direction, halting a token may trigger one of those escape rules. Now, regardless of whether the token can or cannot move, a player always still gets their mapping phase. At that point, they have a choice to make. Where are they going to map a tile, and which tile are they going to map? They can map either their memory tile, which they have in hand and know, or the top tile from the stack, which could be anything randomly. Again, they choose where it's placed, they choose its rotation. It has to be a legal placement, as previously discussed, and based on some special rules that I'll discuss later, because the mapping of outputs has some limitations on it, as does the mapping of a delete tile. Rather than mapping, a player may choose instead to pass their mapping phase. That's allowed. They just don't map anything. Or a player may instead choose to swap their memory tile instead of mapping. When they do that, they take their existing memory tile, put it at the bottom of the stack, face down, then draw the top tile of the stack to become their new memory tile. They swap it out. Again, if they do so, they don't get to map a tile on their mapping phase of the turn. Alright. Now, after they've chosen their mapping and they're able to move, they make their movement roll. And as I mentioned before, the first hex of movement must be in the direction of the direction roll, after which any remaining hexes of movement can be in any chosen direction as long as it's through open sides. One of the exceptions being if a token, like in the first turn, you've just got the origin, they're going to move off the edge onto an unmapped space. At that point, the token's movement is probably going to end, with exceptions from hex hub rules, and the player then gets to map a new tile in that location, the unmapped space. Again, they have a choice. They can map either their memory tile or the top tile of the stack. The same rules apply. They can choose the rotation, the location is set, and there are special rules for the mapping of output or delete tiles, and especially if those tiles come up randomly from the stack, there are particular rules when they're mapped into a new empty space unknowingly. So that has to be kept in mind. Whichever way, whether the token runs out of hexes of movement or moves off the edge of the map and maps a new tile, once the token is out of hexes of movement, that player's turn ends, and play moves on to the next player to the left. Now, as I've mentioned, one of the possibilities for movement, the best possibility, the goal of the game, is to move a token onto an output, to exit from the map and score a point. When this happens, when a token reaches an output, again, it's taken off the map and scores a point. Now, assuming that you're not the first player to reach the target score and win the game, then on your next turn, you place a token back on the origin, and then continue your turn as normal from there. So in this way, each player has one token on the map at a time, trying to exit each one in turn. This is made more difficult by a special rule for the mapping of output tiles. That is that an output tile may not be mapped any closer than 6 tiles away from the origin. That is, the minimum distance is a straight line mapping, that is by the shortest possible path. So no side branches, no looping around. From the origin to a potential spot for an output. What this does is create a radius around the origin within which no output tiles may be mapped. Any mapping that would place an output tile too close is illegal and cannot be completed. So, that also limits when an output can be mapped during your turn on your mapping phase or when mapping off the edge of the map. So for example, if you are moving a token off the edge of the map onto an unmapped hex, and you choose to draw randomly from the stack and draw an output, if that location is not legal, if it's too close to the origin, then you can't map that output. In that case, the output goes to the bottom of the stack. It's a risk you take. You then have to draw the next tile from the stack and map that instead. Also, if it's on your mapping phase, that is, mapping between your direction roll and your movement roll, and you choose to draw from the stack, draw randomly, and pull an output, and there are no locations yet on the map that are legal placements, the same applies. You can't map that output, it goes to the bottom of the stack. So sometimes it's a bad outcome from taking the random risk. Sometimes it's just unavoidable. The other tile type with particular special rules for mapping is the delete tile. As I mentioned before, this is because a delete tile does not map and create a new mapped hex. Instead, it unmaps an existing mapped tile. When it's mapped, a delete is placed over top of an existing tile and makes it unmapped. Then, later in that player's turn or on subsequent turns, players may then map a new tile on top of the delete tile as if it were an empty space on the map. Similarly, it's considered unmapped, so tokens can't move through it without stopping there to map the tile at the end of their turn. Now, because of that, again, if a player moves off an open side onto the edge of the map and chooses to draw randomly from the stack and draws a delete, they can't map it there. That tile or that hex is already unmapped. However, unlike the origin, they don't lose the opportunity to map the delete. Instead, The token moves back to the tile it just moved off of, its prior origin, and then the delete tile can be mapped normally as if it were during the mapping phase, that is, on any existing mapped tile, with some exceptions. A delete tile cannot be placed on the origin, you've always got to have the origin mapped, and it cannot be placed on any tile that already has a token on it. Again, the token has to be on a mapped tile. Otherwise, any other tile on the map, any hex hubs, and any outputs can potentially be deleted. This creates an interesting strategic option. You can stop an opponent from exiting by deleting the output. It just also deletes it for you to use as well. Also, deletes are particularly powerful if you are stuck, if you need to open up a path to go a different direction, or, as we'll discuss later, if your token is caught in a trap.
The last of the special tile types is the hex hubs. As I mentioned before, these are the unique tiles with all 6 sides open. However, each hex hub also has a special rule which alters movement for tokens which land on that tile. By the way, don't forget that the origin counts as a hex hub. Another of the hex hubs is called Go Home. If your token lands on that tile, it goes directly back to the origin. However, you don't lose any remaining hexes of movement and can and must keep moving afterward if any hexes of movement remain. The hex hub called Reboot is similar but a little less helpful. If your token lands on that hex hub during movement, the token is removed entirely from the map and your turn ends. At the beginning of your next turn, then place a token on the origin and continue the turn as normal. The hex hub called Halted limits movement in another way. If your token lands on this tile, it stops moving. It loses all remaining hexes of movement and your turn ends. Next up comes Random, which doesn't stop your movement, but alters its direction. If your token lands on this tile, you make a new direction roll. Your token's next hex of movement, if it has any hexes of movement remaining after landing on random, of course, that next hex must be in the direction rolled. And then after that, any remaining hexes of movement still can and must be used in directions that you choose. There are 2 related but opposite hex hubs, each with 2 tiles each in the stack instead of 1 like the other hex hubs. These 2 are Slower and Faster. Slower subtracts hexes of movement. When your token lands on this tile, roll a d6, then subtract half of that number, rounded up, so from 1 to 3, from your remaining number of hexes of movement for the turn. If the result is 0 or less, you stop moving and end your turn there. The Faster tile, instead, adds hexes of movement. If your token lands on Faster during movement, roll a d6, then add half that number rounded up, again between 1 and 3 hexes. Add those to your hexes of movement for the turn. You move faster. The remaining 4 hex hubs are more generally helpful. How about Hub Hub? If your token lands on this hex hub, it must immediately move to another hex hub on the map. And don't forget, the origin counts as a hex hub, even if none others are mapped yet. And yes, the effect of the destination hex hub, if any, still applies, and any remaining hexes of movement may still need to be used. The next hex hub is Trader. If your token lands on this hex hub during movement, swap that token with any opponent's token on the map. If there aren't any opponent's tokens on the map, though, this tile has no effect. Once more, after being relocated, your token can and must still use any remaining hexes of movement. Then there's Jumper. If your token lands on this hex hub, immediately remap Jumper with your token, and any others aboard, to a new legal location on the map, that is, to an unmapped hex adjacent to a mapped hex. Your token then can and must use any remaining hexes of movement afterward. The final hex hub is rotate. If your token ends its last hex of movement on this tile, that is, ends its movement with no hexes remaining, you may and must change the rotation of any one map tile to a new orientation. You can imagine how powerful this effect can be, especially later in the game. Like the delete tile, a rotate tile landing can rearrange existing paths, making movement easier or harder. It's important to note that any of these given hex hubs may only cause its effect once per player's turn. That is, you can't cross the same faster tile twice to get more hexes of movement, and you can't use jumper twice. Fortunately, the same slower tile can't slow you down twice, and the random hex hub doesn't cause random movement if you cross it a second time.
Now, aside from the effects of hex hub tiles, other movement through the map is linear, from tile to tile. That is, when you can move and you're not halted. Sometimes the direction roll dice are not kind, and you can continue to roll closed directions over and over, especially when stuck on a filter tile with very few open, just one open direction. That's why in the game there's an option to use escape rules. Now, players need to agree on which escape rule, if any, they're using at the beginning of the game. Each of those rules will reduce the time on average that tokens spend halted, so it cuts down on some of the tedium of the game. But each of those rules also has strategic effects that will change the play of the game. Of course, the simplest rule is the null rule, or no rule, which just means if you're halted, no matter how long it takes to escape. The default rule, and the one I recommend, is called reboot. When a token gets halted, it can be halted only 3 turns at most. When you roll the third direction roll to a closed direction, that is the third time the token is halted, a player has the option to reboot that token. Simply put, they take that token off the map. It's no longer stuck on that tile, but it's not on the map either. At the beginning of their next turn, the player then places a token back on the origin, and then starts their turn as normal. Now note that choosing to reboot is always optional. You can continue to leave a token where it is through multiple turns halted, 4th, 5th, 6th, and so on. Sometimes strategically that might actually make sense. You're very close to the output, or there's a direction that you want to go. Or if you happen to have a, no, actually, that's the main reasons. But on that 4th, 5th, 6th, or so on turn that you're halted, you can choose to reboot at any time. Another option for an escape rule is called double. That is, after you're halted on the first turn, then on your second turn, you can roll 2 dice, both of the dice, for your direction roll. Now, if both of those dice turn up a closed direction, the token remains halted for that turn. If, however, the dice roll 2 different numbers, and one of the 2 is an open direction, then the token can and must move in that direction. If 2 different numbers are rolled and they are both open directions, the player gets to choose which of those open directions their token will move for its first hex. So, in this case, there might potentially be a choice offered. The third escape rule is called finite, meaning that a token can only be halted a limited number of turns. Each time you're halted, that direction no longer can be rolled. If on subsequent turns you re-roll that closed direction, you roll the die again. Each time you hit a direction you've previously been halted on. So, no matter what, on that 6th turn, and probably sooner, you're going to escape hex. Now, the fourth escape rule, appropriately enough, is called fourth. In this case, you will escape on the fourth turn no matter what. If a token is halted for 3 turns, then on the fourth turn, if they roll a closed direction, ignore that. Instead, the player then gets to choose any open direction and can and must move that direction for their first hex of movement. So like double, this one potentially could give a choice, but a little bit farther along perhaps. And finally, the last escape rule, an option for players to choose, is called reroll. In this case, if you roll a closed direction for each time you're halted, then on subsequent turns, and you roll another closed direction, you can re-roll that direction die a number of times equal to the number of previous turns halted. So, on your first turn halted, no re-roll, 0 turns previously. On your second turn halted, you roll another closed direction, you could re-roll once. But if that second direction is still closed, still halted. Third turn halted, roll. If that's closed, re-roll. If that's closed, re-roll. If you roll a third time and it's still the closed direction, still halted. So again, this is going to cut down on the number of turns that a token spends halted on a particular tile. Notice again that each of these options, no matter what the group chooses, either no rule or one of the escape rules, it's going to affect the strategic play of the game. Now, no rule means that tokens will spend longer halted, and that can be frustrating, but it also means players are much more likely to leave open paths to restrict themselves and possibly others less. Whereas rules like double or fourth that offer a choice may possibly allow tokens to go the way you want and get to outputs a little bit faster in some cases. Reboot, the default rule, does have the effect that sometimes when you're stuck, that's actually better. You don't want to take that path anymore because it's too difficult. You can go back to the origin and try another path entirely. So, keep that in mind, and like I say, before you start play, have everyone agree on whether an escape rule is going to be used and which one you'd like to use for that game. Now, being halted is frustrating and prevents movement, but there's another possibility that can be more annoying and also prevents movement toward an output. That is a happy accident which became a deliberate feature of the game: traps. A trap is a grouping of tiles in which the outside border is closed and there's no way to move anywhere except back onto those same tiles. That is, again, it's closed all around the outside and there's no output included in that grouping. So the simplest type of trap, you might guess ahead, is 2 filter tiles with the open sides facing one another. There's nowhere to go except onto those 2 tiles. More complex traps can be formed out of a grouping of bridge tiles with their open faces all facing one another, 3 at minimum. And more complex traps can be formed out of multiple tiles as long as they meet that criterion, that is, closed all around the outer border with no access to the rest of the map and no output in there, because that would be a way to escape. Otherwise, the token has nowhere to go. If in such a case, a token is not permanently stuck. Now, it's important to note that you cannot form a trap through mapping that includes the origin, whether accidentally or deliberately. That is because there must always be a potential path, a possibility of a route from the origin to at least one output. A trap won't include an output, so if the origin's caught in one, there's no way to escape tokens, or no way to exit. So, those mappings cannot be completed. The same goes for uses of the rotate hex hub that would create a trap enclosing the origin by turning a tile. Also not allowed. Now, if you're caught in a trap, you can get out. That is, at the beginning of your turn, if you have a token that's in a group of tiles like this, you can declare, I'm trapped, I'm going to reboot. This is very similar to the effect of the reboot hex hub or the reboot escape rule. You remove the token from the map, and your turn ends there. No mapping phase, obviously no movement. So it's frustrating and slows down the player. This is one of the reasons you might want to create a trap deliberately to catch another player's token. At the beginning of their next turn, then, the player puts a token on the origin, and their turn starts and continues as normal from there. Now, just like the reboot escape rule, rebooting from a trap is optional. You may choose to stay within that trap. For one thing, not rebooting lets you keep mapping if you want to do so, maybe to stop a player from exiting their tokens. Also, if you have a delete tile, either in your memory or you think you might draw one soon, that's a way to get out. You can unmap one of those tiles, remap it, and make a path out of the trap. Or, if the rotate tile is caught within the trap with you, that's another way out. That's important to note because when considering whether a grouping of tiles constitutes a trap, you only consider normal movement. That is, again, the outside out of those tiles is all closed. Don't consider the movement effects of hex hub tiles. So even if there's a rotate in there with you, or a jumper that would let you map that tile out again, it's still considered a trap and you could still potentially reboot. Now, this is going to be very rare to occur because, again, a hex hub has all 6 directions open. So in order to be caught in a trap, it would have to be surrounded on all 6 sides at a minimum by other tiles that create that closed border. So it's not going to happen very often, but when it does, you don't have to consider the hex hub movement as part of judging whether something is caught in a trap. Same thing applies with the origin. Just because there's a way out from a hex hub doesn't mean it's not a trap including the origin and thus illegal. Now, if a game goes long enough, players will eventually have drawn all of the tiles from the stack. The stack becomes empty. At that point, players no longer have the option to map tiles by drawing from the stack. Instead, they can only map their memory tile. And once that memory tile has been mapped, it can't be replaced. At that point, if the stack has been emptied and a player has used their last remaining memory tile, then they can no longer map hexes. They skip the mapping phase of their turn, and tiles can no longer move off of the map onto unmapped hexes. Essentially, when that happens, no stack and no memory tile, all edges leading off the map onto unmapped hexes are considered closed for all other applications of that rule. So if you roll that direction, the token is halted. If it's halted, it may apply an escape rule. At that point, once there's no more mapping possible, the only thing left to do is to move your tokens through the map and try to get that last token to reach the target score exited. Now, when a game runs particularly long, and if there's a time limit for the players, you may want to end a game early. This is allowable. However, all players need to agree to an early ending at that point, and you have to wait until the end of a round, that is, when all players have had an equal number of turns. At that point, once there's agreement, the game ends, and the winner is the player with the most tokens exited at that point, the highest score. If 2 or more players are tied for the highest score, at that point, the winner is the player who exited a token during play first. The first one to get a token off the board, again, out of those with equal highest scores at that point. That's the basic game of HEXMAP. Now there are a number of variant rules that have been created for other game options, if you'd like more variety, a little more complexity. The first of these options, and I'll address these briefly rather than in full detail, each one changes one of the fundamental rules of the game and then a few additional rules to coordinate. So the first option possibility is called multiple memory. In this case, instead of getting just one memory tile at a time, players are dealt a hand of 2, 3, possibly even 4 memory tiles. So, dealing out multiples. Then, during their turn, a player can choose to map any of these memory tiles, any one. When they do so, they can then replace that tile from the top of the stack, at least until the stack is empty. So in this case, having the multiple options means it's more likely that players are going to be able to map strategically from tiles that they've seen and know that they have, rather than taking random chance from the stack. They may still do so and still have that option, but it becomes less likely. Again, I recommend a hand size of only 2 or 3. More than that, and mapping becomes much easier and more predictable. The next option is called multiple tokens. In this variant, instead of having one token on the board, or at most one token at a time, players may potentially have multiple tokens in play at once. When setting up for this variant, give players just the number of tokens matching the target score for that game. So if the target score is 3, they start with just 3 tokens. On the beginning of each turn, if a player does not have a token on the origin, they may place another token from their allotment on the origin. Then during their turn, when they make their direction roll, they choose which of those tokens that direction roll will be assigned to. If that direction is open for that token can and must move. If the direction is closed for all of their tokens, the player has no option but to be halted, but they choose which of their tokens has been halted. This has appropriate applications to which escape rule might be used. Players can potentially have up to a maximum number of tokens equal to the target score for that game on the board at once. And this opens up options for cooperation between tokens. For example, one token caught in a trap may be released by a different token that finds the rotate hex hub. The third variant option is team play. In this variant, multiple players are working together and pooling their target score. You could potentially have 2 teams of 2 players, 2 teams of 3 players, or 3 teams of 2 players together. These players are seeded so that no 2 players on the same team are adjacent to one another, and that players on different teams are maximally distant from one another. Players each get their own color and control only their own tokens, so play proceeds normally from there. Except that each time a token is exited and scored, it counts for the team's score, and when a team reaches the agreed target score, they win together. This creates opportunities for strategic play so that teammates can help one another by mapping open paths for their allies, as well as, again, using rotate and other effects to aid one another, and also trying not to block one another, which can be as difficult. Now, each of these variant rules could be used singly or in combinations. You could have a multiple memory, multiple token team play game. However, this is going to get very complicated very fast and be a bit of a whirlwind to follow. I recommend playing with each variant rule singly to see how it goes, how you like it, and then trying combinations later. I hope this explanation has given you a clear idea of how HEXMAP is played, and even better is if you're interested and would like to play yourself. I've playtested the game several times, and each time we get something very different, a unique outcome. But I'd also be interested in seeing how play comes out for other people, perhaps not as familiar with the rules and strategy. In any case, thank you very much for watching, and a good game to you, whatever you play.